So the next panel is about developing solid HTA submissions with the best RWE possible. You guys are bad on the time for talking and the time for silence, but good thing I'm not a school teacher. So the next panel will be moderated by Nabil Tadros, Director of Real World Evidence at PDCI. He'll be joined by the panelists Amanda Downey, Global RWD Strategy Lead at Roche, Dr. Mina Tadrous, Assistant Professor at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto, and investigator at the Ontario Drug Policy Research Group, and finally Kevin O'Connor, former Director of Federal and Private Healthcare at Johnson & Johnson. Welcome to our panelists.
All right.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Nabil Tadrous, the Director of Real World Evidence at PDCI, which is a division of McKesson Canada. And I have the privilege of moderating this exceptional panel of experts. Despite what the title says, we're not actually focusing just on health technology assessments. We're focusing on enhancing the quality and utility of RWE. And of course, it'll include health technology assessments as well. So let me give first each panelist an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their areas of focus. Start with Mina.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Nabil. We're not related. I think we'll just get ahead of it.
That's right.
Our community is not really creative with last names, first names of that sort. So, although I'd be honored. That is one way to get on the panel, right? You get your uncle or something to pick you, and a real career booster, nepotism at its best. But that's not what happened today. So I'm Mina Tadrous. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Real World Evidence and Pharmaceutical Policy. And I've been thinking about real-world evidence for a long time, and so my area of work is thinking about how do we better use data to inform policies and make access to medications better and ensure that patients are getting the right meds. And so I'm excited to talk about what the next steps are and how to keep moving forward the RWE opportunity. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Neil. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Amanda Downey. I'm one of the global medical directors at Hoffmann La Roche. I work with a team based out of Basel, Switzerland. I'm located here in Toronto, Canada. And I'm responsible for the real-world data strategy at Roche across our top 10 pharmaceutical markets. So we're looking at different areas where we can generate and use real-world data. The field is expanding very quickly, as all of you know, so we're trying to harness that evidence into tangible output so we can use internationally and opportunistically. So it's great to be here. It's great to talk about real-world data.
Thank you, Amanda.
Good morning. I'm Kevin O'Connor, and as my introduction said, I'm former of Johnson & Johnson. It doesn't mean that I was fired. I left after 33 years at J&J, and the majority of my time was spent in market access. And I worked directly with payers, both public and private, led teams that worked with payers, and was an avid advocate of utilizing real-world evidence and have some learned experience of where it was applied and where we tried and it wasn't applied.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, let's get into our panel discussion today. Each of you bring a different perspective and experiences on RWE. Each of you also knows that despite the growing importance of RWE, there are still challenges and questions that persist. So I want to give each of you, from your perspectives, an opportunity to give a brief opening statement on maybe one or two of the most important areas that you think that manufacturers need to focus on to enhance the robustness and application of RWE. And we'll start with Mina.
Awesome, thanks very much. So it's a very big question. So 2 years ago, I was lucky enough to help develop and write the National Guidance on Reporting for RWE. And it's through that process that I started thinking about how can we better support the ecosystem in Canada. And to be honest and be blunt, my North Star has become very obviously, how do we make Canada the place that people want to go for RWE? And I really, if you can leave with one thing that I said today, it's that I want people to think better and bigger than just thinking about your single drug getting approved in Canada, but how do we incorporate Canada into the broader development of RWE? You just heard the panel right before us talk about rare diseases, and the problem with rare diseases, the crux of it is sample size, which means like one country cannot solve developing evidence in that space, and so the development of international cooperation becomes essential. So for Canada to become the epicenter or one of the centers that people depend on, just like in clinical trials or any evidence development, it became obvious from my conversations that there was two main gaps that I'm hoping to try to fill. The first is capacity. So I'm an academic. We like to teach people. We're developing training programs. We're developing grad students. Many of them you might hire. And so I think that that's the first space that we can be in. I think it's important to have enough people that are skilled in this space to do it at a high level, and that people want to go there. The second thing is I think we've had a lot of test cases, we've had a lot of pilots. We love pilot studies in Canada, and we haven't really got to a place where there's a seamless process where a manufacturer at an international level says, I can go to Canada, do this RWE study, and it's going to get done on time, at a high quality, and I can link into the high quality data that they have. And so that public-private partnership piece and how to tackle that is going to become so important, because I think that's how we unleash kind of the potential of what's happening. And so to me, it's those two spaces, the potential and ability to link those two spaces, and how do we develop the capacity to support it.
That's excellent. A lot of important points there that we'll unpack in a moment. Amanda?
So I would maybe add two complementary elements. I would say standardization and collaboration. So I appreciate the comment about Canada being the epicenter. As a Canadian working on a global stage, I would love Canada to be the epicenter for everything. But Canada is one piece of a very big industry.
Absolutely.
And so I think Canada's role could be a leader in this bigger industry. And I think we can't forget our additional top 9 markets that largely reside in the EU and the US, and really make sure that we're collaborating with them to develop real-world evidence that has widespread utilization, and instead of trying to fit it into the 2% Canadian market on a global scale. I would say the second part of that is to make sure that we can standardize our data globally as much as possible. And I mean like that, I am under no preconceived notion that that's easily done, as easily as said, but I think it's critical. And I think sometimes you have to start somewhere and take a small chunk and build upon it in order to make something widespread and usable. And I think that we really have to look at what are our must-haves, what is a nice-to-have, what will impact the data quality and integrity, and really work to standardize what we can and move forward with the little piece so that we can build it into something bigger. But I absolutely agree that Canada has the tools to do that and can be a leader globally, and I would love to see it become the epicenter of the world.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kevin?
Sure. I'll switch gears just a little bit. Agree, having Canada as a research center and recognized for RWE would be a terrific badge to wear. Flipping it on to using RWE in Canada, I would encourage manufacturers to really push provincial governments, push for a framework on how RWE can be used. Often what drives investment often from a pharmaceutical company in Canada is the market that they participate in. If the market isn't accepting of RWE, or if there's just uncertainties or really unpredictability, I think that we heard from Jared Rines, it becomes a little harder to bring the investment in. I think there's a wonderful opportunity. I actually think for payers, the utility of RWE is really a great opportunity, but I'd encourage pushing for a framework.
Great. Thank you. Those are great opening thoughts. Mina, you referenced the fact that last year you were very involved in developing the guidance document for reporting of RWE to CDA or CADIT. Can you tell us maybe where manufacturers should really focus their attention in order to be able to align better with those guidelines? The guidelines are very comprehensive, some might say daunting. Where should they focus?
So thank you very much. So I think the guidance in itself was sort of putting the horse in front of the wagon. And so to the point that my colleague made, I think the next step is figuring out when to use it. But we first wanted to know how and what should be reported. Because I think one of the main problems we were facing is that, and I'm sure manufacturers in this room have dealt with this, is that when we were on the other end reviewing the submissions, the variance in quality of reporting made it so challenging to even use. And so we would see some submissions that were excellent, and I could see some that wouldn't even pass a thesis submission, right? Like and when we'd go back to them, it wasn't that the people weren't smart doing them, it's just that they would look at us and say, you didn't tell me what you wanted. So I think just at a broader level, like the core of the guidance is just around transparency and being able to report the quality so someone on the other end can assess it. I think the challenge is when you're thinking about developing RWE is getting ahead of it in time. So I think the worst time to think about the reporting guidance is when you have the evidence and you're trying to put it together. The best time to be thinking about it is when you're planning your study, because we have for a protocol. Like you have to do things like a clinical trial. You have to say what I'm going to do, and you have to register a protocol, which means you have to be thinking about it beforehand. The second, and I think probably the most daunting thing right now for everybody, and this is to your point, is the quality of the data and the standardization of that. You guys are getting vendors out of everywhere. I was just at another conference last week, and there are hundreds of vendors, especially in the US, who are promising RWE and the best data in the world. And then when you ask them for what their quality is, it becomes like a magic box. Like you don't know what's in there, proprietary hands go up, and I can't tell you what's in here. And that's gonna be challenging, because how can I, a reviewer of that evidence, when I get that on the other end, know what's in that box? And I think this is the biggest challenge. So I think having candid conversations, thinking ahead of time of who you're going to as vendors for now, and then if there is data that's vetted and known, I would probably be leaning into that and then push on your vendors to add more transparency, because they're not going to start doing it until you say so. So I guess it's the planning ahead, the protocols, and thinking about the quality of data, because if you do those two things, the rest of the guidance and everything becomes easy.
Okay, great. Just to follow up maybe a little bit on that, you know, since the guidance has been published, have you had an opportunity to sort of get some feedback on how manufacturers have been doing so far, and is there anything that you can tell us about that?
So I think I get a lot of comments about it. I think the two biggest points of feedback, one is like just I think people haven't had an opportunity yet, and it's probably to the first point. We don't have a framework of when you can submit RWE. So the first point is like, great, you told me what to report. When can I do this now? And I think that's when we're looking for Health Canada and the CDA to start pointing to spaces where they can do that. So I think, outside of the guidance, it's sort of like, how can I use this and when? And I think the second point is just like the amount of comprehensiveness in it. And I still believe, like, if people go through the process and they go through it like I was talking about, they'll find that most of the components are already in there.
Okay.
These guidances are in line with every international guidance, and that's on purpose, because we don't want someone to go develop a study globally, which is what's happening, and then Canada's like, well, we want this additional extra 3 pieces, which are like impossible to do, and then it holds us back from getting access to medications and the proper evidence. And so, I think that's kind of the best part. Whatever's happening globally in your companies is probably going to align with the guidance regardless.
Okay, wonderful. So maybe on that point, we'll switch gears a little bit and continue, Amanda, with that global perspective. You have a global RWE role. What do you feel that Canada can learn from what is happening in RWE in other countries, particularly in Europe, the US? Someone yesterday even mentioned Japan. Anything at all that you feel we can learn here?
Yeah, I think Canada's taking the right steps, right? Like, I think Canada's doing something. They're releasing guidances. Mina, to your point, I don't know that the tools are there to tell the Canadian market when to use it, how, and what the best way to do that is. The FDA is starting to do that, especially from a regulatory perspective. I think EMA has released some guidance, and I mean, NICE in the UK are typically seem to always be spearheading the way. So I think the tools are there. I think the direction maybe is not. And I think that the FDA especially is very good at providing a lot of direction. And so I think if there's something that Canada could learn, it would be to be a little bit more deliberate with the what and the when. And I think that would help perhaps expedite the decision making. And I think that, you can't write off the Canadian market necessarily just because it's little, right? I think that Canada remains one of the major markets in the pharmaceutical industry. There is a lot that we can learn from Canada. Canada has a national healthcare system. I know it's provincially governed, but I think that provides us with a massive opportunity. And I think that we should relish that and take that opportunity and become really specific and direct with when we use our evidence. And it goes to the role of leadership, right? But I think Canada has the tools there. They have the methodological approaches there. The guidance is there. Maybe the direction is not quite where we need it to be just yet.
Thank you. I'll give Kevin and Mina an opportunity to add any further comments on that.
Reflecting on our efforts that I was involved with to launch RWE projects and do it in partnership with a payer, private insurance tended to be more open, maybe because the rigor required wasn't as high. And we did get a couple projects off the ground during my time working with private insurance, and they provided insights that were very valuable, insights into, very candidly for one project, really I helped identify to the payer, this is what's happening to people as they progress through this disease, and it had the insurers really align themselves to, this is something that we need to invest in. So it was very good, it was justifying. On the public side, where we've stumbled more often, has been around, I think what you had said, Mina, or akin to what you had said, we could not, we would talk about the idea in general, the concept was interesting, we could not land on agreement on the data set, could not land on who would look at the data and who would mine the data, and then also we couldn't land on what would be the utility of it. So, this data will answer a question, positive or negative. What would be the outcome of the positive or the negative? So, conceptually, we had conversations, but then we stumbled.
Yeah.
Okay. Mina, I don't know if you have anything to add on the global...
on the global stage, I think for me, there's two comments come to mind when I was listening to you speak. One is, and I'm really glad you said it, we're always being reminded that we're a small market, but we're still, I think, in your top 10, right? So it's not like, there's 200 and whatever countries, and we're still in the top 10 markets. So I think there's always this kind of conversation, and it's because we live in the shadow of the US, which is by far the behemoth of the pharmaceutical market. And so living in that shadow means we're always kind of compared. The second thing that I go around and tell people is using Canadian data and conducting work here, we're kind of like a Goldilocks in the sense that we have the universal healthcare system that makes us sort of look European, the second or third largest market, depending on how you count it. But we have a pharmaceutical space that looks like the US a little bit. And our population is as diverse as them. And so you kind of have this opportunity to say, well, it's a very competitive environment in the sense of what the Canadian data sets, the populations we can draw from, and what that looks like. And I think, we have to be a little un-Canadian and maybe have a chip on our shoulder about it a little bit.
Okay. Kevin, you just alluded to maybe some things are happening on the private payer side. Do you think to any meaningful extent RWE is being incorporated at all into value-based pricing or outcome-based agreements, or are we still quite a ways off from that?
Yeah, and this becomes what I am aware of, and so what I was involved with. As far as going into an outcome-based agreements that I've been exposed to are really pretty simplistic, right? It's almost like a trial prescription. It's the patient responding, then we will continue to reimburse it. What I have not seen and has been discussed, but haven't seen it activated, is we're uncertain about the impact of this drug, and by the impact that we're uncertain about the worth of this drug. In a real world evidence protocol, we can generate what the worth will be. And then we will have the determination of the drug either continues to be reimbursed, it continues to be reimbursed at this rebate, or the rebate value changes, or perhaps even reimbursement discontinues. I have not seen either a manufacturer or a payer, public or private, be brave enough to take that step yet.
Okay, okay. You again alluded to some of the issues. Can you elaborate maybe a little bit further on maybe some of the key issues that the payers are raising with you, or have raised with you in terms of why maybe they're not as interested in incorporating RWE yet, or they have some concerns?
Yeah, on the private market, there's a keen interest in it. The difficulty in the Canadian private market is it's fragmented, right? Because you're not going to do something that is an RWE project with one insurer, and then the next, and you cover off all 23. That it's just when your end numbers get so small, and it gets difficult, gets expensive. So being able to group the insurers together or have a protocol that can be appreciated by all of them is key. I think it's doable, and there are examples out there. On the public side of the business, it gets back, I'll give a quick repeat, which is which data set is being used, get into details about how is it collected, for example, like patient support program data. There can be some terrific data in there. I do agree with the public payer. There needs to be more rigor put around how the data is collected. But whether it's another database, you often get a public payer saying, I just disagree with that data and how it was collected. Or they disagree with who the data scientist is. And then there is just that, pharma and a public payer landing on, what are we going to do with it? What does it mean at the end?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give you all a moment to ask questions, in a moment. But just one more question before we get into questions from the audience, and that is maybe what some of the key accessible sources of real-world data are. Maybe I'll start with Amanda to see whether you've found some accessible sources of real-world evidence either here in Canada or globally.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would go back to Mina's comment. We often go to the U.S. as our starting point because it's the best shopping market, right?
Yeah.
We can pick and choose, and there's vendors galore. There's tons of data sources in the UK. I think in certain disease areas, we're starting to see registries, multi-country registries. These are really interesting things for us, multi-country registries, because it allows us to look at it globally and also stratify it by country-specific outcomes.
Okay.
And I would say, excuse me, it's lovely when the mic is on when you cough. It's fine. I would say one of the most appealing things we look for in these multi-country registries is really limited missingness, which often means it's limited endpoint collection. But as much data completion as we can secure in these registries, this is something that we look for. So I've been working very closely with a registry called the Fight Retinal Blindness Registry. It's in 27 countries. It specifically looks at ophthalmology outcomes. We know ophthalmology is a very big and growing market. We also know it's a very expensive market. So it's something where it's hyper competitive. It's important to track our outcomes. It's important to consistently demonstrate value for money. And so if we can do that across 27 countries, that gives us the most bang for our buck.
Okay.
So that's really something that we look to. I would love to see it come to Canada. I know that we have disparate data sets. We have great data sets in terms of the ICES data set. We have the IQVIA data set. There's differences in terms of how the data is collected, but sometimes the wider we can cast our net while ensuring data integrity and data completeness, this is something that we really look for globally. And that's why, going back to your first question, yes, I think Canada is a key collaborator on a bigger global scale. I think that's one way to raise the profile internationally.
Okay, super. Mina, would you like to add anything? ICES was referenced.
Yeah, I think accessibility of being able to use the sort of rich volume of public data is one of the big problems we're trying to tackle, and I think that becomes that dynamic. One thing I go around for anyone that'll listen and say, like, certain data sets are great on their own, And the best data set you have is mediocre on its best day. When it becomes magical is when you link it. And so that data linkage and data sharing is when things become powerful. The problem with that is that we have to, it's not a methods issue. Most of this data is easily, we've linked hundreds of data sets, we've done it often, we can do it quickly. It's actually the governance, the compromise that has to go into that, and some of the lawyer speak that goes around that. And so I think that's the bigger issue that we have to continue to tackle. And there has to be like a real want to be there. I think on the global sense of like how data can be run, I think just to illustrate to people, because we often get a thing like, oh, there's challenges of doing this. About 6 months ago, we worked with 9 different countries to do a study, replicating the exact same study across 9 different countries, 100 million patients, for a safety signal, and we were able to do that study in 3 months. Okay? So when there's a will and there's an ability to do it, the data sources at a high quality are there. It's not the science, it's not the data, it's actually all the other stuff that goes around it that's really limiting us in our ability to do that. So the accessibility part, when you say that comment, is challenging, but the data quality and the things that are available in Canada, especially if we start figuring out the linkage, are really, really strong.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Let me just see if there are any questions in the audience. Just have a few brief moments. There's one question here.
Hi. So one thing we often don't talk about is the privacy laws that operates in RWE. Do you think the current state of the law actually facilitates, or there are barriers, or if there are any changes that need to be done?
So from my experience, the biggest issue is that most people, when they come and think about data linkage and using it for RWE, are thinking about it 2 years too late. And backtracking on your use of your data, especially like for PSPs or other collection or registries, that's the biggest challenge. So the privacy laws are written in a way that would allow linkage as long as people agree to it, and you can go through the methods. Now, there's a playbook, there's a way to do this properly. But the problem is, like, we get contacted way too late, and then we look at the agreement that the patient signed, and there's nothing in there about linkage. There's nothing about so you can't come in later. So I think this is one of those things that's like the current laws make it challenging if no one's agreed, especially if you're bringing in a registry data that's not within the PHIPAA laws or within that space. But if you thought about it beforehand and the patient knows that this is going to potentially be linked, and you planned ahead, it's rather, I think from the privacy angle, it's important. And when you go and merge with these entities that establish it, we have structures that have been doing above board privacy stuff. We get pulled into the commission. If there's new data sources, we get audited. Like, there's a whole process here, and we've met that rigor. But again, it's that thinking ahead that I think really steps in the way. When you come later, this has happened in the digital health space a lot, where we have these people that want to prove the real-world evidence of their integration, and they come to us later and they're like, oh, they're tech companies, so they're excited about their data. You open up the thing and you're like, oh, this is crap, and there's not, you're not even allowed to link this, and then the whole thing just stops. So.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you. You raised a good point about the importance of time, and there was mention yesterday in the context of planning for a patient support program and how oftentimes RWE planning is embedded far too late in the planning cycle for a specific product. Can you share your thoughts when is an ideal time to start thinking about and planning for embedding a real-world evidence strategy into planning for something like a patient support program?
Maybe I'll have Amanda address that. We know that Roche is involved in a number of projects trying to improve the quality of PSP data.
Yeah, and what I would say, I think, maybe from an industry perspective, is that how we consider and incorporate real-world evidence keeps getting earlier and earlier in the life cycle, and I think that's a really positive thing. Awesome. And so I would say that we begin as early as pipeline now to look at some of the real-world evidence that surrounds whether it's burden of treatment, burden of illness, but then taking that and using it to inform our later decisions in terms of when we get ready for commercialization, when we get ready to compete in the market, how we compete, how we continue to demonstrate value for dollar, things like this. So I would say real world evidence doesn't stop at those early burden of illness studies. Like perhaps sometimes we would do them, we would check the box, and we would move on into later pipeline development. So I would say the answer to the question is probably to include it right at the forefront. So usually PSPs are historically very much a commercialization tool, and a tool that enables access for patients. And I think including data capture into those programs, I think, is absolutely critical. We're starting to see the outputs of what that means when you do it right, and when you're able to collect that data from PSPs and how you use it. And it's really multifactorial, right? I mean, it's not just market access. We are at a market access meeting, but it is medically, it is globally competitive. There's commercial elements to it. It really is widespread use. So I would say the earlier the better, and I think we're seeing that in terms of integrating our evidence planning into overall strategic planning as early in the life cycle as we possibly can.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Time is up, but Kevin, maybe I'll just give you a brief moment, maybe give us a closing thought on where you see RWE maybe 3 to 5 years down the road.
Yeah, sure, thank you. I was smiling at what you were saying very quickly because my former employer owned and operates their own PSP, so it's all in-house. So the number of times in this one specific category that got very competitive, and we actually had a request from a government, and we have the data, but we didn't have the consent. So, concur that, planning for RWE prior to NOC is critical with PSPs. RWE, I think there's lots of promise. I'm probably going to sound like an echo of myself. I think there's so much promise for it. I think there's promise for payers. I think there's promise for pharmaceutical manufacturers. I think it can make reimbursement potentially even maybe a little quicker or a little clearer. I really, really believe that we're at a cusp right now, whereas RWE becomes more frequent, more available. Having that framework with how this will be used, how it will be collected, what are the rules of the game going to be versus creating work and it's not utilized in the way that you imagined.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Our time is up. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.